They left me out of the family will completely. Then they found out. Grandpa had a second will. Nobody knew about my name is Laurel Danes, and I am 37 years old. 2 years ago, I sat in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March and listened to my grandfather's will being read aloud. 14 people in the room. 14 people who had shown up, some of whom I had not seen in years, all of whom had apparently known what the will contained before they arrived, because not one of them looked surprised. I was the only one who looked surprised. My grandfather, Edmund Danes, had been a careful man, a methodical man, a man who kept records the way other people keep photographs, obsessively with dates and labels, because he believed that what gets documented gets remembered, and what gets remembered gets honored. He had built a modest construction business in western Pennsylvania over 40 years, the kind of business that never made headlines but paid salaries reliably for 3 decades and left something behind when he retired. The will divided his estate among his 3 children and their families. My father's share went to my father and my 2 brothers. My aunts received their portions. Various grandchildren were mentioned by name. My name was not mentioned once, not a single line. Not a footnote, not even an explanation. I sat in that lawyer's office and listened to my own family's name read 14 times, and my name 0 times. And I kept my face very still, the way my grandmother had once taught me to keep my face still when something hurt in public. What I did not know, sitting in that room, was that there was a second document. That my grandfather, the careful man, the methodical man, the man who believed that what gets documented gets remembered, had prepared something else, something he had given to a different lawyer in a different office, with instructions that it not be opened until 30 days after the first will had been read. He knew exactly what would happen in that room on that Tuesday in March. He had planned for it years in advance. He had planned for me. Before I take you back to where this started, please like and subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the family that made my grandfather feel he needed to write 2 documents instead of 1. I grew up in Harwick, Pennsylvania, the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter. My brothers, Curtis and Dale, were 5 and 7 years older than me, which meant they had always existed in a slightly different family than I had, one where I hadn't yet arrived to complicate the math. My father, Ronald Danes, was a complicated man in the specific way that men who feel overlooked by their own fathers become complicated. He had worked in my grandfather's construction business for 12 years before a disagreement over company direction had ended that arrangement badly, and the bad ending had calcified over the decades into something harder than anger, a permanent low-grade grievance that colored everything in our house, including, eventually, me. I was my grandfather's favorite. I want to say that plainly because it matters and because pretending it wasn't true would make the rest of this story harder to understand. Edmund Danes and I had a relationship that existed almost entirely separately from the rest of the family, and everyone in the family knew it, and not everyone in the family was comfortable with it. Every Saturday morning from the time I was 6 until I was 16, my grandfather picked me up in his truck and we went somewhere. Hardware stores, job sites, the county fair, a lake he knew 40 minutes away where the fishing was reliable. He taught me to read blueprints when I was 8 because I had asked how buildings knew where to go. He taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 11 because he believed everyone should know where their money was at all times. He told me stories about his own father and his father's father, and he asked me questions about what I thought and what I wanted, and he listened to the answers the way very few adults listen to children, like the answers actually matter. My brothers found this irritating. My father found it threatening. My mother, a quiet woman named Helen, who had spent 20 years absorbing the ambient temperature of my father's grievances, found it worrying in the way she found anything that might cause conflict worrying. Nobody said anything directly. That was not how my family handled things. Things were handled indirectly, through sighs and silences, and the particular way a room temperature drops when someone walks into it. When I was 14, my father sat me down and told me that my grandfather was not the man I thought he was, that Edmund had treated his own children poorly, that the favoritism he showed me was a manipulation, The same manipulation he had used on all of them when they were young before he disappointed them one by one. I listened. I nodded. Then I got into my grandfather's truck the following Saturday and didn't mention it, because I knew what I knew about Edmund Daines from 10 years of Saturday mornings, and what I knew did not match what my father had described. My grandfather never spoke against my father to me. Not once in all those years, not even when I was old enough to ask real questions and would have understood complicated answers. He simply kept showing up every Saturday and taking me somewhere and teaching me things and asking what I thought. That restraint, I understood much later, was its own kind of answer. I left for college at 18, University of Pittsburgh, on a scholarship I had applied for myself, because asking my father for help with college applications would have involved acknowledging that I intended to leave, which would have involved a conversation nobody in our house knew how to have. My grandfather quietly covered the gap between the scholarship and the actual cost without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone, which I discovered when I got to school, and my account had more in it than I expected. When I called to thank him, he said, "Learn something useful," and changed the subject. In college, I studied architecture. It felt like the natural extension of everything Edmund had taught me. Blueprints, structures, the question of how buildings knew where to go, scaled up into something I could spend a life doing. I was good at it. I graduated with honors and took a job at a mid-sized firm in Pittsburgh that did mostly commercial work with occasional residential projects that were the ones I actually cared about. I visited my grandfather every month. I drove the 40 minutes from Pittsburgh to Harwich and sat on his porch and drank his coffee, which was always too strong, and talked about whatever he wanted to talk about. He was sharp until well into his 80s. He never forgot what I'd told him the previous visit. He never asked the same question twice. My father's relationship with him during those years was what it had been since the business disagreement: formally civil, practically distant. My brothers both lived within 20 minutes of Harwich and visited on holidays and occasionally for Sunday dinners, but their relationship with Edmund was the surface kind, the kind that exists because proximity makes it necessary. My grandfather knew the difference. He had always known the difference. The man who kept records knew exactly who had shown up and who had performed showing up, and those were not the same thing. He died in January 2 years ago. He was 89. It was his heart, which had been reliable for decades and then was not. I had visited 3 weeks earlier, and he had seemed tired in a way I hadn't seen before, and I had stayed an extra day without quite knowing why. And we had sat on the porch even though it was December and cold, both of us wrapped in blankets, not talking about much, just sitting the way we had always been able to sit. He squeezed my hand when I left. He held it for a moment longer than usual. I drove home thinking about that extra second. I think some part of me already knew. The funeral was in Harwich, at the church he had attended for 60 years. It was well attended. Edmund Daines had been in that community for a long time, and people remembered him. Afterward, at my father's house, there was food and conversation, and the particular social choreography of grief, where everyone performs normalcy because nobody quite knows how to perform sadness in public. My father mentioned the will reading, scheduled for 6 weeks later. He said the lawyer would be in touch with everyone who needed to be there. He said it with a casualness that I registered but did not examine, the way you register something at the edge of your vision without turning to look at it directly. He said everyone. He did not specify what everyone meant. I want to tell you about the 30 days between my grandfather's funeral and the will reading because they were strange days and I think they matter. I went back to work. I designed things. I visited a job site in Shadyside where a residential renovation I had been overseeing for 8 months was finally in its final stages, and I stood in the finished kitchen and felt the particular satisfaction of a space that had been made to work correctly. I thought about Edmund a lot during those days. Not with grief exactly, though grief was present, more with the particular quality of attention you give to a person after they're gone, when you can finally see the full shape of them. I thought about the Saturday mornings, the blueprints, the too strong coffee, the hand held 1 second longer than usual. I thought about something he had said to me, almost offhandedly, on one of the last visits before he died. We had been talking about the construction business, about a project I was working on, and he had said, "The most important thing in any structure is what you put underneath. Nobody sees the foundation, but everything that stands, stands on it." I had assumed he was talking about architecture. I found out on the drive to the lawyer's office that I had been excluded from the will notification list. My cousin Tara, who was driving with me, mentioned that she had received a certified letter 2 weeks earlier about the reading. I had received a phone call the day before from the lawyer's receptionist, which I had assumed was the standard notification. It was not the standard notification. The certified letters had gone to everyone whose name appeared in the will. I had received a phone call instead. I understood what that meant before I walked through the door. I understood it the way you understand something you've been half knowing for a long time. Not as new information, but as confirmation of something that had been sitting quietly at the edge of your awareness, waiting to be acknowledged. I kept my face still, the way my grandmother had taught me. The will was read. 14 names, 0 of them mine. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father put his hand on my shoulder. He said that Edmund had made his decisions and they had to be respected. He said he was sure I understood. His voice had a quality I had heard before, the specific warmth of a man who has gotten something he wanted and is being careful not to show too much of it. I told him I understood. I drove home alone. I sat in my apartment for a long time. I did not call anyone because there was no one to call who would understand the specific texture of what had just happened. Not the money, not even the exclusion, but the public nature of it, the 14-person audience, the confirmation that my name had been deliberately absent from a document my grandfather had spent years constructing. Here's what I want to ask you, because I think this moment is one people recognize even if the specifics are different. Have you ever sat somewhere after something has happened and felt, underneath the hurt, a strange kind of clarity, like the thing that just hurt you has also finally told you something true? Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because what arrived 30 days later changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather. 30 days after the will reading, I received a certified letter, not from my father's lawyer, from a different firm entirely in Pittsburgh whose name I didn't recognize. The envelope was heavy, the kind of envelope that contains multiple documents. My name was on the front in a label that had been printed, not handwritten, which meant it had been prepared in advance, probably long in advance. Inside was a cover letter from an attorney named Margaret Osei, who explained that she had been retained by Edmund Daines 14 months before his death, and that she had been given specific instructions regarding the enclosed documents and the timing of their delivery. She had been instructed to wait 30 days after the reading of the primary will before making contact. Beneath the cover letter was a document my grandfather had titled, in his own handwriting on the tab, simply "The Rest." I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice before I allowed myself to understand what I was reading. Edmund Daines had, over the course of his life, made a series of investments separate from the construction business. Quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. A parcel of land in western Pennsylvania, purchased in 1987, that had sat undeveloped for 30 years while the area around it changed. 3 investment accounts opened in the early 90s and managed conservatively, reinvested annually, never touched. A commercial property in a small town outside Pittsburgh that he had rented to the same dry cleaning business for 22 years. None of these assets had appeared in the first will. None of them had been disclosed to the family lawyer who had drafted the document read to 14 people in March. They had been placed instead into a trust established 8 years before his death, amended twice in the years following, with Margaret Osei as trustee and one named beneficiary. Me. Total value of the trust, as of the date of Edmund's death, was just over $2 million. The land parcel alone, in an area that had seen significant development over the previous decade, was appraised at $800,000. There was a letter. Of course there was a letter. My grandfather was a man who documented things because he believed what gets documented gets remembered. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, in the careful print he used when he wanted something to be legible for a long time. He explained the trust. He explained when he had established it and why he had used a separate attorney and why he had waited 30 days after the first will before allowing me to know about it. He said he had known for many years that his estate would be contested if he left anything substantial to me directly. He said he had watched his son's relationship with his own children carefully, and he had seen the particular dynamic that develops when a parent's unresolved grievances become a family's operating temperature. He said he had not wanted the last thing I received from him to be a scene. He said, "I have spent your whole life trying to make sure you knew that someone saw you clearly. I did not want the last thing I gave you to require you to fight for it in front of people who would use the occasion to diminish you." I put the letter down and looked at my kitchen wall for a while. He had known. He had known what would happen in that room. He had known about the 14 names and the certified letters and the one phone call and my father's hand on my shoulder in the parking lot. He had known it years before it happened, with the particular certainty of a man who has observed his own family honestly for decades. And he had built something underneath it, something nobody could see, something that would stand. I called Margaret Osei the following morning. She was businesslike and warm in equal measure, the way good attorneys are. She walked me through the trust documents, the asset valuations, the process for formally accepting my role as beneficiary. She had clearly been prepared for this call for some time. I asked her when my grandfather had first contacted her. 8 years ago, she said. He had come into her office on a Tuesday afternoon in October, alone, carrying a manila folder of documents he had organized himself. He had explained what he wanted clearly and completely and had asked if it was possible. She had told him it was possible. He had said, "Good, I want to make sure she has somewhere to stand." I had to set the phone down for a moment after she told me that. I called my father that evening. I want to be honest about why. Not to announce anything, not to watch his reaction, simply because he was my father and something significant had happened, and whatever the shape of our relationship, I was not going to let him find out through other channels. I told him about the trust. I told him the value. I told him that Edmund had established it 8 years earlier with a separate attorney specifically to ensure it wouldn't be part of the estate that had been read aloud in March. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He never told me." "No," I said. "He didn't." 8 years, he said. "Yes," I said. Another silence. Then, he stopped, started again. He always did things his own way. I did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been cruel, and cruelty was not what I wanted. What my father was sitting with in that silence was between him and his own understanding of his father, and that was not a conversation I could have for him. I told him I had wanted him to hear it from me directly. He said he appreciated that. We said goodbye without resolving anything, which was how most of our conversations ended, and which I had made a kind of peace with. Curtis called 2 days later. He was angry in the way people are angry when they feel something has been taken from them, even when the thing was never theirs to begin with. He said Edmund had obviously not been thinking clearly when he set up the trust. He said 8 years before his death, Edmund had been showing early signs of cognitive decline. This was not true. I had spent those 8 years visiting my grandfather monthly and watching his mind stay sharp. But I understood it was the story Curtis needed to tell himself. I told him he was welcome to speak with Margaret Osei if he had concerns about the trust's validity. I gave him her number. He did call her. She explained clearly and completely that Edmund had been assessed by his physician as fully competent at the time the trust was established, and that the trust had been amended twice in the years following, both amendments executed with the same legal rigor as the original. She had kept records. Of course she had. My grandfather had chosen her for exactly this reason. Curtis did not pursue it further. Dale called once, briefly, to say he thought the whole thing was unfair. I told him I understood he felt that way. He said he guessed he'd see me at Christmas. I said I guessed so too. The conversation I keep coming back to, the one that sits with me the most, was not with my father or my brothers. It was with my mother. Helen called on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after I'd told my father. She called at the time she always called, 9:15, when she knew my father would be out on his walk, which told me she had thought about this call and decided it needed to be private. She asked how I was. I told her I was okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather loved you very much." "I know," I said. "He used to talk about you," she said. "When he came for dinner, he'd find a way to bring you into whatever we were talking about. Your father didn't like it, but Edmund, he was always finding ways to say your name." I didn't know that. My throat tightened slightly. "I should have done more," she said. "When you were growing up, I should have—" She stopped. "I let your father's feelings about Edmund become the family's feelings. That wasn't right." I let that sit for a moment. "Thank you for saying that, Mom," I said. She said she loved me. I told her I loved her too. We stayed on the phone for a while longer, not talking about anything important, just staying on the line, which felt like its own kind of thing. I am still an architect. I am still in Pittsburgh. The job site in Shadyside finished 6 months after my grandfather died, and the client sent me a photograph of their family in the finished kitchen, 3 generations around the table, which I printed and keep on my desk. The trust has been settled. The land parcel is being developed carefully with a firm I selected myself on a timeline that makes sense for the land rather than for speed. The investment accounts are being managed. The commercial property still has the same dry cleaning business in it, run now by the original owner's daughter, who called me when she learned about the ownership transfer and said she was relieved the building wasn't going to be sold out from under her. I told her she had nothing to worry about. The lease would be honored. My grandfather had always honored his leases. My father and I speak. We are not close, and I do not expect us to become close, but we are not nothing either, which is more than we were for some of the years in the middle. He asked me once, about a year after everything had settled, whether I had known about the trust before he died. I told him no. He nodded like he was filing that away somewhere. He has never apologized. I have not waited for an apology, because waiting for something that may not come is its own kind of imprisonment, and I have spent enough years in rooms that didn't quite have space for me. What I have instead is the letter, 4 pages in my grandfather's careful print, the explanation of what he built and why, and the line I return to most often, the one that sits with me on the mornings when I'm working on something complicated and need to remember why the underneath matters. He said, "The most important thing in any structure is what you put underneath. Nobody sees the foundation, but everything that stands on it." He wasn't talking about architecture. He was talking about me. If someone in your life built something quietly to protect you, something you didn't know about until you needed it, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who has ever sat in a room where their name wasn't called and wondered if anyone had ever seen them clearly. Sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones doing it quietly in another room in a document nobody knows about yet. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you in the next one.